Assalamu alaikum everyone. I was supposed to upload another video regarding the topic of boundaries today. However, there has been a slight change in that plan. I was guided to share a personal incident instead. I'm not really comfortable sharing anything pertaining to my personal life this way, but I don't like going against my intuition either. So, the other day, an elderly gentleman, someone who's a relative in a way, approached me with a question. He asked me what I was up to these days, but because I knew the underlying reason for his inquiry, I deliberately responded in a way that made it easier for him to bring up the question as to why I am so interested in books and why I spend so much time reading. Let me give you a little of a background here. This is a small town, and specifically the community that I'm part of, intellectual pursuits like reading are not particularly valued here. Books are seen as tools for passing exams or securing government jobs. Anything beyond that is considered an unnecessary indulgence or even a wastage of time and money. Given my interest in reading, writing, and learning, I have been portrayed by a couple of women in this community or circle as not sound in the head. Uh, the thing is that here women are more accustomed to a life where gossiping is an essential part of a daily life. It is taken as a mark of a healthy mind to gossip and spread the secrets of one household to other households. And anyone who prefers books over gossip, or anyone who is not interested in other people's private lives, is considered somewhat mentally unwell. So, as a result of my enthusiasm for books, my mental health has been turned into the subject of gossip purposely. But I'm more kind of a person that believes wholeheartedly in, that quote that says, people will talk behind your back. Make sure you give them an interesting topic. So, let me give them something interesting to talk about. I hope they talk about the books that I read too instead of just me and my mental health. And because I'm feeling generous, this video is dedicated partly to them. If people want to be petty, let's make sure something good comes out of that pettiness, because this incident has affected a few teenagers in my vicinity who also love books. One of them, a young girl, seemed quite startled and apprehensive when she saw how I was being negatively portrayed for enjoying something as enriching as reading. She didn't voice it, but I could sense her unease at the thought that she might face similar judgment for her own love of books. So this video I'm making is for anyone living in an environment where books are undervalued, where they are seen only as a means to an end, like passing exams rather than as a source of personal growth or joy. So when this gentleman finally got to his point, he asked me, what good will reading books do for you? The irony of this question is that considering he works in the field of education, he shouldn't have been asking a question like this. It's surprising how distorted perceptions can sometimes lead even educated people to act out of character. And even more ironic is that the person who has started this entire campaign against me is someone who doesn't even know how to read or write. So why it's ironical is that an uneducated person is gathering educated people to see me as unstable because I read books. It is it it actually blows my mind. Like, can an uneducated person be so smart that they can manipulate educated people? Or is the issue with the educated people who have acquired degrees but still the value of learning is lost on them? Anyhow, I saw an opportunity in this interaction. This man is someone who listens, and those who listen without arrogance have the capacity to understand. So that gave me hope that despite the skewed picture he may have been given about me, he still might be willing to see my perspective and grasp how important seeking knowledge is for Muslims. Looking back, this was not just about setting boundaries, it was a chance to set the record straight on many levels. So, I'm using this entire incident as a reminder for people who find themselves in somewhat similar situations. And what I want to remind them is that Pursuing our passions unapologetically, even if it challenges the status quo, is not something to be afraid of, especially when that passion is for Islam. We should not limit ourselves just because people around us are not yet interested in growth. We keep growing, we keep evolving. We never know who we are inspiring to change, to grow when we are busy with our own growth. That's not being pompous or self serving, no. And we know this because of the dua that has been mentioned in the Quran, where Allah Azza wa Jal tells us that believers make this dua that, Ya Allah, make us role models for the righteous. We are Muslims, and in a community where any aspect of Islam is alienated or even frowned upon, we shouldn't be afraid to set an example. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim. Knowing what can uplift the ummah, but hesitating to pursue that path due to the fear of how it might create a negative impression upon some or a lot of people about us, it only shows a lack of determination within us in pursuing Islam, in pursuing the love of Allah Azza wa Jal. The problem with us is that we want everything to be easy. I was reading this book by Muhammad Asad. It's a famous book titled Islam at the Crossroads, and the author who had accepted Islam had this to say about Muslims. And remember that this is his observation before accepting Islam. So, this is what he had to say. The reality, however, of present day Muslim life appeared to be very far from the ideal possibilities given in the religious teachings of Islam. Whatever in Islam had been progress and movement had turned among the Muslims into indolence and stagnation. Whatever there had been of generosity and readiness for self sacrifice had become among the present day Muslims perverted into narrow mindedness and love of an easy life. Then he further says on the same page, I realized that the one and only reason for the social and cultural decay of the Muslims consisted in the fact that they had gradually ceased to follow the teachings of Islam in spirit. Islam was still there, but it was a body without a soul. He conveyed this observation of his in his book, which he wrote in 1934. And I was thinking that, does this mean that nothing has changed since then? Why has that problem been left unresolved? Why are we still struggling with the same issue? We are the same Muslims who bemoan the sad condition of the Ummah, and we wish to change these conditions, yet we don't realize that if we really do want to change the world, then we have to be willing to go against the tide. Allah Azza wa Jal tells us in the Quran, He says, O Prophet, if you were to obey most of those on earth, they would lead you away from Allah's way. They follow nothing but assumptions and do nothing but lie. We need to accept this reality. We need to accept that we are going to be targeted. We need to accept that if we want to really follow the truth, then majority is going to be against us. We are going to be in the minority. And if we are afraid of the opinions of other people, then what are we even doing by calling ourselves Muslims? What are we going to accomplish with this lack or fearful mindset? Why do Muslims even have this victim mentality? We are only doing a disservice to ourselves and to everybody else with this attitude. Everybody will go against me if I really follow Islam, so I'm helpless. What can I do? I'll tell you what we can do. We can show some backbone. How about that? Just because we may belong to a small town, it doesn't mean that now we have to stay small, or that we have to shrink ourselves to be accepted in a close-minded society. It's better, far better to be considered a misfit, to be mocked at, than to shrink one's own mind and love for Islam in order to be accepted by people who are repulsed by the idea of growth, or who don't aspire to become learned or live a life that one would feel proud of on the day of judgment. So, I read both Islamic and non-Islamic books. And during our conversation, when he brought up this question, he wasn't referring to academic textbooks specifically, because as I mentioned earlier, if you are studying for a job, then reading is celebrated. We are conditioned to see the purpose of books only within that framework, where their value is tied to securing worldly benefits. We usually do what serves us. We rarely do what serves Islam. And gaining knowledge for Islam is a service not only to our own souls but to humanity as well. But we are so selfish that we would rather spend our time hurting others than healing ourselves and people through Islam. So, when it comes to books that explore deeper subjects like understanding faith, or uncovering one's purpose, or reflecting on the journey of a Muslim in this dunya, such books are often dismissed as unnecessary. It's a strange paradox where the very books that foster inner growth and guide us in navigating life meaningfully are undervalued, while anything perceived as solely career oriented is instantly validated. The funny thing in this entire scenario is that no matter how much we dislike books, at the end of the day, we want very knowledgeable teachers for our children. And yet, we forget that a teacher becomes knowledgeable through books. The same books that we seem to look down upon, that teacher who is brilliant at his job, he is the person who spends a good chunk of his time studying and practicing the subjects that he teaches. That is why that teacher is brilliant at what they do. Anyhow, as I mentioned, I was fully aware of what was being said about me, but before having this conversation with the gentleman, I purposely chose not to address the issue for two reasons. First, I understood that the person behind building this whole narrative, portraying me as mentally unstable for spending so much time with books, was doing so out of a personal vendetta, which meant that engaging with such a person would have been futile because the intent wasn't rooted in a genuine concern for me, but rather to act upon the grudge that they hold against me, which is actually sad if you ask me. I mean, the amount of energy and effort and time and intellect that we use to hurt someone's reputation, if we would spend even the half of that for Islam, things wouldn't be as bad as they are for this ummah. Second reason was that when I noticed that most people, as I mentioned, around me didn't value reading to begin with, they quickly accepted this distorted narrative that this person was spreading about me. This made me realize that trying to explain to them that gaining knowledge is a hallmark of a healthy, curious, and engaged mind rather than a sign of eccentricity or instability would be pointless. For them, books are simply not part of their worldview. So, no amount of reasoning would shift their perspective. And I don't go around begging people to understand the value of reading tafsir or biographies. Because if you don't value the best kind of knowledge, I am not going to devalue that knowledge by begging you to spare at least some minutes on it to realize how amazing this knowledge actually is, or how amazing Islam is, or how much in need we are of knowledge. One of the things that I have learned about relationships is that things can sour very quickly if we are overly enthusiastic about Islam without acknowledging the weaknesses of the person we are engaging with. They are, after all, a human being just like us, and yes, sometimes silence is the best response, especially if we know that what we say might be twisted or misunderstood or not valued. But other times, there are people who genuinely do listen and make an effort to understand, and sometimes even we get to be surprised about how many there are that, if we give them a chance, they do not only listen but want to listen and want to understand. So, we should never feel intimidated by the age or background or authority of the person disagreeing with us. When we remove intimidation from the equation, the conversation becomes more authentic, connecting us on a soul level. And ultimately, we must remember that the goal is for Islam to prevail. If the other person can convince us through evidence and reasoning that we have misunderstood Islam in a particular aspect of life, that's awesome. We need that feedback because it's not about winning arguments or proving a point at the expense of our faith. Rather, it's about ensuring that what emerges from the conversation is aligned with the truth of Islam. That is the real victory, right? So, in those situations where the other party does seem to be interested, it's good to remain open to dialogue rather than shutting down. A simple conversation at the right time can reveal to us how much the other person is capable of understanding our point of view. And based on that, we can decide how to proceed or not to proceed. So, I felt it was important to address this issue, and the gentleman's question provided me with the perfect opportunity because not only was the young girl feeling that indirect pressure, But I also felt that having this conversation might prove fruitful for the gentleman as well, if not those who were sitting with us. Because when we had this conversation, obviously we were not alone there. So I got a chance to put forth my opinions too. While I won't go into the minute details of our discussion, I would like to share the thoughts I conveyed to him, as they might help others facing a similar situation. He said that everybody has Islamic knowledge these days, particularly now that we have so many YouTube channels, and he said that that's why there are so many sects refuting each other. What he was implying was that reading books is not essential anymore because knowledge is now on our fingertips. Now, here is a problem, and I said that to him too. I don't agree with this narrative that everybody has knowledge these days, of Islam, that is. What they have is information, data that they have gathered. Most of the time, what people have are opinions based on that information that they have memorized, not knowledge. And the less knowledge people have, the more opinionated we find them. If we really had knowledge, if we really had knowledge, we wouldn't be where we are. We memorize information and we think now we are knowledgeable. You know what the difference between the Jahil of the past and the Jahil of today is? In the past, a Jahil knew that they were Jahil. They had at least this amount of knowledge, and because they were aware of their ignorance, because they had at least this little knowledge, they had respect for knowledge and the one who had knowledge or was in pursuit of knowledge. But the problem that we are facing in these times is this Jahil of today doesn't know that they are Jahil. And because of this, not only are they happy in their ignorance, they are even proud of it because they deem themselves knowledgeable. The Jahil of today looks at knowledge as something repulsive because they think they already are too wise and too knowledgeable to seek any more knowledge. And this Jahil looks at those who are seeking knowledge as mentally unstable because it is difficult, almost impossible, to let themselves comprehend how valuable knowledge is and how important it is to seek and keep seeking knowledge. They cannot understand the point of it. And this lack of understanding is why he brought up the fact that I hadn't attended his son's wedding. That was a complaint from him. He seemed genuinely confused about which ideology or sect I follow. And this lack of knowledge or this lack of understanding is something that creates a kind of a wall between two people. Like, I cannot even say to him that I don't attend because I love Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because then he will say he loves Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam too, and I won't disagree. But how do I explain that when you are in the process of learning, your love is very different from the love that you have when you are not actively seeking knowledge? So I just say that the reason I avoid attending weddings is that these functions aren't held in masajid and the groom, along with a large group, goes to the bride's house to eat. It is not Islamically correct. Because these two reasons are well known, particularly thanks to Dr. Israr Ahmad Rahimullah. The gentleman's complaint was that my absence meant I didn't care about them. And I said to him something that I really wish that we all would understand. See, just because a person has a different mindset than mine, it doesn't mean they don't care about me. Just because I want to live my life according to my principles, it doesn't mean that now I don't care about you. We can have completely different ways of living and still care for each other. Love means giving the other person the space to be the individual that they are. If I want somebody, particularly a Muslim, compromise their love for Allah Azza wa Jal and their love for Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to please me, then it is not love, it is sickness. And this doesn't have to offend us. You can convince me and I can convince you, and if we still disagree, it doesn't mean that now one person has to hate the other. Anyhow, when I said we can have different way of living and still care about each other, he said that deen has to be balanced with the dunya. And I really want to address this issue because this statement is frequently quoted by Muslims these days without, in my view, understanding the gravity of what they are actually saying. Let me make one thing clear first. As I said, he is a gentleman and very willing to listen instead of being a know-it-all. And he's like a father figure to me, and I really love him and respect him. But this observation that when Muslims talk about balancing the deen and dunya, it usually means praying 5 times a day and fasting in the month of Ramadan, and if possible, Hajj, and the rest of the life is to be lived according to one's own desires instead of what Islam teaches. And this right there is a superficial approach towards our deen. Most of these people do not even realize that they have this flawed mindset of what balance really means. What they refer to as balancing deen and dunya, it is much more about compartmentalizing Islam into specific rituals while living the rest of lives on their own terms. With this wrong understanding of balance, we miss the essence of Islam, which is to live in submission to Allah Azza wa Jal in all aspects of life, whether it be rituals or work or relationships or leisure or whatever. What we usually do is that we pray and fast and think our job as Muslims is done, and we follow what the majority is doing in almost all areas of our lives, and then we call this an act of balancing the deen and the dunya. Allah Azza wa Jal says in the Quran, O you who believe, if you help Allah, He will help you and plant your feet firmly. Now, we know this, that we rarely think about what we will say when we are asked on the judgment day, what did you do for Islam? How did you help Allah's deen? Are we going to say we helped by praying and fasting? These were meant to build strength within us in order for us to really serve Islam. I remember Dr. Israr Ahmad Rahimullah in one of his lectures, I don't remember which lecture it was, but he said something along the lines of, these 5 pillars of Islam are exactly that, pillars. We are supposed to build a beautiful and enduring structure over those pillars. Otherwise, those pillars alone are just ruins. Those pillars had a purpose. We erected the pillars and then thought that our job is done. This is the Muslim of today. We keep erecting those pillars, but nothing, we build nothing on those pillars. And we're happy with it. We think our job is really done. And this is because we don't take time to think about these things. Thinking and reading are looked down upon in our society. And true balance is not about dividing deen and dunya into separate spheres. Let's get that straight. It's about integrating the dunya into the deen so that every action becomes an act of worship. Balancing the deen and dunya doesn't mean giving Islam a limited space in our lives. We are not balancing, we are compromising our deen in order to serve Taghut. But because we refuse to seek knowledge, we don't even know who or what we are actually serving. You know, when I look back, I'm amazed by how quickly time moves. And I purposely asked him this question too, since he is older than me, if he feels the passage of time even more acutely. He agreed with me. Reflecting on the passage of time is something we all share because it's a universal experience. Life's fleeting nature reminds us that if we take a moment to pause and acknowledge how swiftly time moves, we naturally open the door to deeper reflection on what truly matters. Looking back at life from time to time can remind us of the purpose of our life. The only thing that will benefit us when time runs out is how we lived according to Allah's guidance. Here we are today, and tomorrow suddenly there will be an announcement that the person has passed away and people should come and attend the janazah. So when I die and I'm in that grave, who is going to be with me there? I asked him this question too, and I'm asking the listeners too. When you die and you are in that grave, who is going to be with you? Is there anyone who loves you so deeply that when you die they would say, I'll sit inside the grave with them? Because when I asked this person to compromise their Islam to please me, they immediately ignored Islam over for my happiness. No, we are going to be alone. Breaking news. We are going to be alone. Each one of us alone in our graves, facing our deeds. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, remember death. Remember death frequently. But do we? We have come to a point where if a person talks about death, the other person assumes that this person has cursed them or something. Or people who can't even spell the word psychology diagnose that person with depression. Why? Because they don't want to think about death. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Indeed, the hearts rust just as iron does." And when he was asked, "What is its polish?" you know what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said? He said, "Abundant remembrance of death and recitation of the Quran." Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't just tell us to remember death as a warning, but as a way to realign ourselves. When we truly think about the grave and the hereafter, that's when we realize what matters the most. The opinions of others about how we lived or what we stood for, all of it will be left behind when we die. Allah Azza wa Jal says, "Do the people think that they will be left to say we believe and they will not be tested?" That should let us know that Islam is not easy. When I told him if he were to decide today that he was going to live according to Islam, his family would be the first to oppose him. You know what he did? He agreed with me. We all know what is stopping us from following Islam. Our family members are afraid of our opinions, and we are afraid of their opinions. That kind of makes us a very lower level of a coward, if you ask me. I mean, imagine being afraid of opinions. Like डरना ही था तो किसी बड़ी चीज़ से डरते. And that too, opinions of those who are not really worried about their life after death or are not actively working for that. Even Sahaba had to face opposition from their families. They faced worse, much worse. So who are we to think that the same would not happen to us? We are living in this delusion that we will follow Islam and at the same time there will be nothing difficult about it either. Like we will follow the footsteps of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and at the same time we won't face any opposition or betrayal or slander or pain. We want to follow the Sahaba, but at the same time, we expect our families and relatives to be happy with us. We forget what kind of path this is. And this ayah is letting us know that truth isn't measured by numbers, but by alignment with Allah's guidance. Islam was never promised to be easy. It requires sacrifices. I'm especially talking to those teenagers who are afraid. Islam was never promised to be easy. And when we look back at what all the prophets had to face, what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had to face, what the companions had to face, it removes any excuse for us to think that we deserve an easier path than they had. Dr. Israr Ahmad rahimullah once quoted, I think it is Mustafa Zaidi's couplet, and I'm going to end this video on this couplet. He said, "इन्हीं पत्थरों पे चलकर अगर आ सको तो आओ, मेरे घर के रास्ते में कोई कहकशा नहीं है." अस्सलाम वालेकुम.